We are we are live. See how we do here. All right, this is my first time going live on Facebook. So, we're not even on Facebook. Where are we? We are on we're on YouTube right now. So, thanks for joining us if you have yet. Excited to do this today and just kind of share some things that have been happening um, in our business, and something that I think needs to be talked about more when it comes to cash offers, when it comes to sellers really understanding what it is that they're getting themselves into when they're working with a cash buyer. And I've said it often, and I'll say it again, and that is a cash offer is not a good option for everybody, but it is for the right person in the right situation. And so, um, you know, we'll give it another like minute here, and then we'll kind of get into it. I've titled this live "The Fine Print," the perfect cash offer, um, the fine print. And so, over the next few minutes, I'm gonna share my screen, and we're gonna go over a purchase agreement that I received from a seller. And we're not here to we're simply here just to share the information, to understand what is in the purchase agreement, and then you can ultimately decide. Maybe you're a homeowner, maybe you're a real estate agent, maybe you're an investor. And I think the question that we want to ask ourselves is, based on what we know, is this something that I would be willing to, or is this a purchase agreement that makes sense for me in my situation? And would you sign this particular purchase agreement? Um, so that's really kind of the purpose of the next few minutes, is to kind of go out there, and everyone likes to be able to, as investors, or really this is focused on the homeowner. We, sorry, I need to check something here. My experience having worked with homeowners for the last 15 years is their focus is so much on price, which it should be. But there's other things that need to be looked at as well. And so that's what we kind of want to look at, is the fine print. So we'll go ahead and get this thing started right now. And I'll just kind of share how I got to this point. Um, for those of you that don't know, I've been buying houses since 2009 as a cash buyer. And so literally purchased hundreds of properties directly from homeowners. And I absolutely love it. I love sitting at the kitchen table, helping people evaluate whether or not a cash offer is right for them. And at the end of the day, I look at a lot more properties than I actually buy. And my ultimate goal, and I say this often, is whether or not I purchase your home or not, I just want to be I want to be a resource to you in your decision-making process as you decide the best way to sell your property. And so that is my philosophy when I go and talk to a homeowner. And so about 10, 11 years ago, my brother saw a property that looked vacant. And so he came to me and he said, "Hey, Paul, I want you to go knock on this door." And so, or he found the homeowner's information. The property was vacant. I found where the homeowner lived. I went, knocked on his door, and started to have a conversation with him. Make a long story short, I ended up buying, and he ended up seller financing 3 properties for me for 10 years. And it was a great deal for both of us. He was able to, get the cash flow that he liked, but not have to deal with tenants. And then I was able to get some cash flow and build some equity over those 10 years. And so it worked out great. And after 10 years, I paid off the seller finance note and actually exchange those properties. But I share that with you because I have a personal relationship with these sellers. And so these particular sellers owned a number of properties. And so I had purchased 3 of them. Earlier this year, I actually purchased another property from them on seller finance. And so these sellers trusted me. I think they like me, and we have a history together. And so they had another property that they wanted to sell. And so I went and looked at the property. I gave them a cash offer for the property, and they felt that that cash offer was low. And so I said, "Great." And maybe it was low. I gave them an offer of what I felt I could pay for the property. And so homeowner came back and she said, "Hey, I'm going to go out and get some other offers." And I said, "Hey, you know what? I think that's a great idea. I think that you should do that." And so that's exactly what she did. And so um, she called me on Saturday afternoon and she says, "Hey, Paul, just as we discussed, I've gotten 2 other offers on the property." And so to provide a little more context, these properties, they're in Salt Lake City. They're just kind of 2-bedroom, 1-bath, kind of close to downtown. And so the offer that I gave was, I believe, 181. And so she called me and she said, "Paul, I have 2 other offers. One is at 210 and another one is at 3, or sorry, not 3. The other one that I have is at 231." And I said, "Great. Um, Tell me a little bit more about it." And she said, "Well, they are going to put it in writing for me for the next, tomorrow or the next day." And so that's where I stopped right there. If you're a homeowner and a cash buyer gives you a verbal offer, that doesn't mean anything. And so I said, "Listen, you got to get it in writing because they've given you a number, but we don't know what the actual terms of the property are. Or sorry, we don't know what the terms of the actual agreement are." And I said, there's this difference in, when you're dealing with a cash buyer, there's often the offer price, and then there's like the closing price. And oftentimes the goal of an investor is to have those 2 numbers be different. It's always been our philosophy that, hey, if we give an offer price, right, we are going to close at that price. And that's really the reason why we wrote the book, The Perfect Cash Offer, was to be able to help homeowners so that there's not this difference between the offer price and the closing price. And so I told her, I says, "Hey, we need to be able to get those in writing so that we can see the fine print," because she liked the number, and she especially liked the number compared to what my offer was of 181. What is that? I'm not great at math, but 230, 181, that's almost $50,000 more that this potential buyer could pay. And if that buyer could actually pay that, then she absolutely needs to take that offer. But having done this as long as I have, I'm just skeptical, number one, that it's not in writing, and then number two, well, let's look at it and see what the offer actually says. And so she sent me the offer. And she said, "Paul," or I think maybe she called me on Friday, and then on Saturday she called me with her son and said, "Hey, I got this offer. Will you take some time to be able to look at it?" And so I said, "Great, let's talk about it." So they sent it over, and so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and we'll look at this offer together. And again, the whole purpose of it is, maybe you're an agent, maybe you're a homeowner. The question becomes, would you sign this purchase agreement? And so I just think it's important that, the numbers, the purchase price can sometimes they make the rest of the terms and the fine print, they make it foggy, because all a homeowner is focused on is the price. But again, going back to what's our ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to make the offer price and the offer price and the closing price the same price. And so let's look at this here. So you can see that this purchase agreement is dated June 19th, and it says there it is right there. The purchase price is $231,000 with an earnest money of $1,000. So when I looked at this, the first kind of red flag for me was only $1,000 earnest money. But that's not a make or break, right? We want to be able to take a look at this agreement, right? And there's not like one part of it that's like, that makes the entire thing bad. It's all these different parts. When you add them up, then you can come to your conclusion as to whether or not this is a good cash offer or not. And so we have the due diligence period to be July 17th. We have the settlement deadline to be July 17th. That's interesting. Okay. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And so, and then it has the possession deadline to be July 17th as well. So this purchase agreement, it says the due diligence period, the settlement deadline, and the possession deadline. They are all July 17th. Let's back up. Sorry, I should have talked about this. The reason that a homeowner would consider a cash offer, right, a lot of times is because of the peace of mind, the certainty that a cash buyer can provide that putting it on the market just can't, right? Because there's just too many cooks in the kitchen when you have real estate agents, when you have, buyers, sellers, and real estate agents in between, which they serve a purpose. They're great, right? If that's the tradition or route that you want to go. And so if you are looking for a cash offer, there is a reason why. And it is oftentimes because you are seeking the peace of mind, certainty, and speed that the traditional way cannot provide. So going back to the purchase agreement here, and if you have any questions along the way, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I'll see if I can do two things at one time. But so let's read the fine print here. It says buyer and seller shall pay their own standard and normal closing costs. Oftentimes, cash buyers, they will market themselves as we're paying all closing costs. I don't know if these guys do or not, but right from the beginning, they are saying that you are paying for your side of the closing costs. Is that a make or break? No, but that's just a part of the puzzle, a piece of the puzzle. And so, condition of the property. It says, the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is contingent on buyer's approval of its physical inspection of the property. So they're basically saying that in order for them to purchase the property, they need to approve the physical inspection of the property. That's fair, right? Maybe they'd looked at the property, maybe not. But for a buyer to want to inspect the condition of it, that is completely reasonable. And then it says, buyer shall have until the due diligence deadline to complete its inspection. So let's read that again. Buyer shall have until the due diligence deadline to complete its inspection. So let's go up. When is the due diligence deadline? The due diligence deadline is July 17th. And the settlement deadline or closing deadline is July 17th as well. So what does that mean? That means that between when the seller signed the agreement up until the closing date, that buyer could walk away until the closing date. Now, when I read this to the seller, She said, well, yeah, they can inspect the property, but they can't change the price. And I says, they can come back and ask for a price reduction. Absolutely. And so, but you don't have to accept it. But unfortunately, cash buyers in this industry, do they wait until, the last minute to reduce the purchase price, or do they do they tell you right away? My experience is oftentimes they come back 2-3 days before closing and say, hey, we can't pay that original purchase price. Again, the whole goal is to keep the offer price and the actual closing price the same. And so this was the first big red flag that I saw, that they have until the due diligence period, right, to walk away from the agreement. And it says buyer may terminate this agreement by notice to seller anytime before the date above. So to me, you're just based on this right here, she's potentially just better off putting it on the market, because like the timelines are going to be tighter on the market, with an agent than they are right here. So that's this right here, I would say, is the biggest single mistake that homeowners make, is they don't understand this part of the agreement. And so we will keep going. Seller acknowledges, okay? Seller acknowledges that buyer is purchasing the property in an attempt to make a profit, and therefore gives permission to the buyer to market the property prior to the settlement. So here's something interesting. Of the hundreds of properties that I have purchased, okay, most people, right, I would say know that if they are calling an investor or they are calling a cash buyer, they know that we're not a nonprofit. We know that oftentimes, like, hey, I talked to a guy yesterday. I'm going to see his house tomorrow, and he's like, hey, I know you have to make money, right? And so most people know that, and they're okay with it based on, the condition of the property, or maybe based on their circumstance. They know they're not going to get, quote, full retail value for the property. But what makes this agreement interesting is that, I guess, because they're in it to make a profit, we now have to give them permission. Okay, so the seller has to give the buyer permission to market the property prior to settlement. So again, that's just another red flag that, hey, if they're going to market the property before they close on it, they're more than likely going to wholesale the property. Is wholesaling bad? No, wholesaling is not bad. What my issue with wholesaling is, does the seller know your intent with the property? If they know that you're going to wholesale it, totally fine. But don't market as a cash buyer and say you're a cash buyer, when in reality, you're not a cash buyer and you're just going to go try and wholesale it, right? And so that part of the agreement was interesting to me, because simply because they're going to make a profit, they need to market the property prior to buying it. And then this other acknowledgement here, buyer may assign this contract to a third party without seller's consent or permission. Again, this is just a way for that seller to wholesale the property. Do we have a problem with wholesaling the property? No. But in this case, this particular seller told me, Paul, they told me that they are going to buy the property themselves. Okay? The agreement says different. Moving down here, it says notices under this agreement may be given using the contract of this agreement, a verbal notice, and then written notice. And then here's interesting. Seller authorizes buyer to record a notice of interest on the property, evidenced this purchase agreement. So here's what this seller, or here's what this buyer wants to do. This buyer wants to record a notice of interest on title of the property in the event that the seller wants to go and, gets a little squirrely, gets a little wiggly. They want to be able to basically cloud the title of the property. So that would protect the buyer from the seller going somewhere else. Is that a problem? No, I don't think that's a problem. If you have a legit agreement and understanding and contract between a buyer and the seller, and we're all on the same page, then I think that the buyer, yeah, they should have the right to put a notice of interest on the property. Again, this whole thing is all about transparency. It's all about just making sure that everyone is on the same page. And so moving on here, it says immediately upon the execution of this agreement, the buyer and its successors, heirs, assignments, agents, employees, contractors, and or representatives shall have the right during the term of this agreement and at any time from and after the exercise of the option to go upon the property for the purposes of surveys, tests, measurements, studies, evaluations, appraisals, as buyer seems necessary. So basically, up until the day of closing, the buyer can send in whoever he wants for whatever reason they want. And then here's kind of the part, this last part here. It says buyer may market the property prior to the close of escrow and place the property on any and all online real estate marketing tools. So essentially, what they're doing is they're putting the property under contract, and then the seller is giving the buyer permission to go and market the property, whether it's on the MLS, whether it's on some investor website, so that they can market the property. And it says seller shall make the property accessible to buyers agents for the purposes of marketing the property to potential purchasers. So this is a very wholesale friendly purchase agreement. I want to say it again. I don't have a problem with a wholesaler, right? But when the expectation or the premise or the understanding is that this buyer is going to buy the property because that is what the seller told me that she was told, and then the agreement says different, those two things, they don't align, right? And so this purchase agreement gives all the power or all the control to the seller of, or sorry, to the buyer. And so it's something where, if everything works out perfect, right? And oftentimes it does. There's great wholesalers out there, right? That they have all these kind of, loopholes in the agreement, but they're able to execute. And so let's just use the 80-20 rule, right? That 80% of the time, the wholesaler is able to find a buyer and everything closes great. But there's that 20%, and I think it's that 20% that right now, specifically in this market, with as many wholesalers as there are, they claim to be cash buyers, the lack of transparency with the regulations that are coming from different states in things, that it's that 20% where it becomes a real problem. Because if the wholesaler can't wholesale the deal and they're walking away from the deal a day before closing, that's not right to the seller. That's not right to the industry in general in terms of cash buyers and the value that we provide homeowners. We're not a good option for everyone, but we are for the right person in the right situation. And so with a purchase agreement like this, with the timelines that are outlined, my opinion is this seller is no better off putting their property on the market with a real estate agent than accepting this offer. I would even say they may be better off putting it on the market with a real estate agent than accepting this offer, because at least, number one, when you put it on the market, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands of eyes on this particular property. And number two, you have a real estate agent that any good real estate agent would not accept these terms right here. And so you've got an advocate for you. And so that's kind of what we've tried to do at 1-800-BUY-HOUSES is be an advocate for a homeowner. Like, hey, if we can't give them the highest price, help them get the highest price and help them kind of understand the offer, understand the process. And at the end of the day, that's why we wrote the Perfect Cash Offer, was to be able to help homeowners that get an agreement like this be like, hey, you know what? There are some red flags here. And so hopefully this was helpful for people to just kind of understand what homeowners are seeing in the market if they are considering a cash offer. And so really we just kind of go back to the question that we started with, and that was, you know, knowing what you know. If you're a homeowner, if you're a real estate agent, you know, would you sign this purchase agreement based on what it says? At 1-800-BUY-HOUSES, we are absolutely just in the business of, yes, buying houses, but more importantly, if we can just be of value to homeowners in their decision-making process, then we've done our job, regardless of whether or not we purchase the home or not. And that's exactly what we're doing in this situation right here. Yes, I want to purchase her home. Yes, I have a relationship with her. Yes, I purchased 4 properties from her, but she felt my offer was low. So go out and get offers, but let's compare apples to apples. And I think that's what's most important. And unfortunately, in our industry, when homeowners start getting different offers, they're only looking at the purchase price. They're not looking at the fine print. Well, if you're not looking at the fine print and you don't understand the fine print, you are setting yourself up for failure. So having said that, thanks for jumping on. Hopefully this was helpful, and we will see you next time. And just remember, 1-800-BUY-HOUSES. It's a cash offer that you can trust. Have a great day.